What would you do if someone handed you a life-altering decision? One that promised security but demanded surrender. Suddenly you were expected to marry a stranger. Not for love, not for companionship, but for a contract. A carefully orchestrated agreement where hearts were supposed to stay out of it. And yet, even in the most calculated arrangements, the human heart has a way of rebelling. The first time Aisha saw him, it wasn't in a sunlit garden or at a chance encounter in a crowded city street. No, it was in the sterile, unwelcoming conference room of her family's office. Papers stacked like walls around them. He was sitting across the polished mahogany table, impeccably dressed, his expression unreadable, his hands folded neatly in front of him. That look, part curiosity, part caution, was all it took to send a chill down her spine. She didn't know him. She didn't want to know him. And yet by the end of that meeting, her entire world had shifted. Her father leaned back, eyes sharp behind thick spectacles. "This is necessary," he said, voice low but unyielding. "For both families. For the business. For your future." Aisha wanted to argue. She wanted to scream that love couldn't be forced, that hearts weren't negotiable. But the glint of expectation in her father's eyes silenced her. And so, the contract was presented, a legal document that felt more like a cage than a promise. The days leading to the wedding were a blur of rehearsals, etiquette lessons, and calculated smiles. Every interaction with him was measured, cautious, deliberate. He didn't reach out, and neither did she. They shared the same space but occupied entirely separate worlds within it. At night, in her room, she stared at the ceiling, imagining life before this arrangement. And sometimes, when she dared, she imagined life after, free, unbound, and utterly her own. But then came the wedding day. The air was heavy with the scent of roses and incense, sunlight slicing through the grand windows of the hall. Guests whispered about alliances, about wealth, about what this union represented in a language that felt foreign to her. She walked down the aisle, heart racing, not with love, but with a wild, restless fear. And when their hands touched, something unanticipated happened. A flicker of awareness passed between them, Dini, almost imperceptible but enough to unsettle her, enough to spark a question that would not leave her alone. Could it be possible for something genuine to grow from something so forced? The first weeks were tense. They lived under the same roof, a carefully curated home designed to impress outsiders, not nurture intimacy. Meals were silent affairs, conversations transactional. Yet in the quiet, small gestures began to emerge, an unintentional shared laugh over a burnt dinner, a glance held too long in the mirror of the living room, a hand brushing against the other while reaching for a glass of water. It was subtle, almost invisible, but the undercurrent was undeniable. One evening, during a rare storm that rattled the windows and shook the trees outside, she found herself standing at the balcony, watching rain trace patterns across the marble floor below. He joined her silently, umbrella forgotten in the hall. The world seemed to shrink around them, leaving only the sound of water and the murmur of their own breathing. She wanted to turn away, to maintain the fortress she had built, but instead, she found herself asking the first personal question she had allowed herself. "Do you ever wonder if we might actually—" Her voice trailed off, swallowed by the storm. He looked at her, the shadows and lightning painting his face in fragments. "I do," he said quietly. That single admission, simple and unadorned, set something in motion, a slow, tentative acknowledgement that maybe this arrangement could be more than paper and ceremony. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, the boundaries they had meticulously maintained began to blur. Arguments erupted, sometimes fierce, sometimes absurd, but always with a strange intimacy that neither could name. And in the aftermath, silence was no longer awkward. It was a shared space, a mutual recognition of presence. Yet, just as the fragile connection began to form, life intruded in unpredictable ways. A letter arrived for him, one that carried a threat, vague but chilling, tied to his past. Two choices made long before this contract. The once controlled environment of their home became tense, eyes darting, doors locking, conversations hushed. Aisha felt fear in a way she hadn't anticipated, a raw, protective kind of fear she hadn't thought she could feel for someone she was supposed to consider merely a partner in name. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered into the study, drawn by the faint light spilling from under the door. He was there, hunched over papers, jaw tight, eyes dark. The vulnerability she caught in that moment was disarming. For the first time, she didn't see the stranger she had married. She saw a man burdened by shadows, and a peculiar empathy surged through her, feeling she didn't want to name, but couldn't ignore. "What if this was more than we intended?" she asked quietly, almost to herself. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed the folder slowly, looking at her with an intensity that made her stomach twist. "I've been asking myself that question," he admitted. "More than I should." The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of discovery and denial. They ventured out into the world together, not as a contract dictated by circumstance, but as two people cautiously exploring a connection neither had expected. And yet, there was always the looming presence of the contract itself, the invisible lines that threatened to contain them, to remind them that love, in their situation, was supposed to be irrelevant. And then came the incident that changed everything, the evening when an unexpected visitor arrived at their door. dripping with rain and bearing news that would shake the foundations of the life they were painstakingly building. Secrets, once buried, threatened to surface, and the tenuous trust between them was suddenly tested in ways neither could have predicted. In that moment, they realized the very thing they had been trying to ignore. Love was not just a possibility, but an inevitability. But would it survive the storm that had arrived at their doorstep? Could hearts shaped by fear, obligation, and caution truly find solace in each other? Or was it destined to shatter under the weight of reality? As they stood together that night, rain streaming down, hands brushing in hesitant reassurance, a question hung in the air like lightning before a strike. What do you do when the world demands a contract, but your heart demands more? And as the camera pans out from the window, leaving them silhouetted against the storm, the answer feels uncertain, because just as they begin to inch towards something real, something undeniable, the shadows lurking at the edges of their world begin to move. Someone is watching. Someone is waiting, and the delicate balance they found may be more fragile than they ever imagined. The storm outside intensifies, the wind rattling the glass as if echoing the tension building inside. And there, between the fear and the first flickers of affection, lies the question that will drive everything. Can love, born out of obligation, survive the truths waiting to be uncovered? The rain hadn't stopped. It had only grown heavier, pounding against the windows with a relentless insistence, as if the world itself were trying to drown them in its chaos. Aisha and Rahul stood shoulder to shoulder in the hallway, listening to the storm, feeling it vibrate through the old wooden floorboards. Neither spoke. Words felt inadequate. They had learned, painfully, that silence could hold more truth than any conversation, more honesty than any forced smile at a family gathering. When the knock came, sharp and unexpected, it tore through that fragile cocoon. Aisha's heart leapt into her throat. They both froze, eyes locking, sharing an instinctive understanding. Whatever waited outside was not a visitor bringing greetings. It was a message, a reminder that the past had a way of catching up with you, no matter how neatly you tried to organize it. Rahul moved first, crossing the hall with a deliberate calm that belied the tension coiling in his chest. He opened the door, and a figure stood there, drenched, the rain plastering hair to forehead, eyes hidden beneath the hood. A note was thrust into his hand before the stranger vanished into the darkness, leaving only the sound of retreating footsteps and the relentless storm. Aisha leaned against the wall, trembling not from cold but from anticipation. "What is it?" she whispered, though part of her already knew the answer. Rahul unfolded the note, his fingers gripping the paper so tightly it creased under the pressure. The message was brief, almost clinical, but the implications were devastating. "We know about the contract. We know about her. Meet us where it all began, midnight." They spent the next few hours in a tense, suffocating silence. No one moved. The house felt like a cage, shadows stretching and retreating along the walls as the storm continued its assault. Every tick of the clock was a reminder that time was no longer an ally. For the first time, Aisha saw Rahul not as the distant, unapproachable man she had married, but as a person under siege, carrying burdens he had never shared, a man whose composure now seemed impossibly fragile. By midnight, neither of them had spoken more than a handful of words. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the streets glistened like glass under the pale streetlights. They drove in silence, the car cutting through the night, tires humming against wet asphalt. Neither wanted to verbalize the fear, because fear had a way of growing when named aloud. They arrived at a location neither had visited in years, a crumbling warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Graffiti peeling from the walls like old scabs. Memories surged through Rahul as he parked, his knuckles white around the steering wheel. "It's here," he murmured. "This is where it started." Aisha's curiosity collided with dread. Where what started? He didn't answer. Instead, he guided her through the rusted doors, past puddles reflecting the faint moonlight, into a space that smelled of damp concrete and history. And then she saw them, 3 figures, shadowed, silent, waiting in the dim light. The confrontation was immediate. Accusations flew, hushed but venomous, words laced with threats and promises of consequences. Rahul's past, the life he had thought buried, was exposed, layer by layer, and Aisha, standing beside him, realized for the first time that the man she was slowly beginning to care for had fought battles she had no idea existed. Battles that threatened not only him but the fragile bubble of trust they had built together. But amid the fear, amid the tension, something else flickered, a strange, undeniable solidarity. They weren't just husband and wife by law, they were partners, allies in a fight neither had anticipated but both were unwilling to abandon. Every glance, every subtle movement between them was charged with unspoken understanding, a recognition that the lines between obligation and emotion had blurred irreversibly. The figures left as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving behind a silence that was almost heavier than their presence. Aisha and Rahul remained in the warehouse, the echo of their own breathing the only sound. He turned to her then, and for the first time, there was no barrier, no careful composure, just raw, unfiltered truth. "You have to know," he said quietly, "I never wanted this life to touch you." Aisha's chest tightened. "Then why am I here?" "Because you're the one part of it I can't imagine losing," he admitted, his voice low, trembling slightly. The admission hung between them like fragile glass, beautiful and terrifying all at once. They left the warehouse as dawn began to break, the first pale streaks of light painting the horizon. The city felt alien, washed in soft grays and golds, as though it too were witnessing the transformation unfolding between them. And in that quiet morning, Aisha allowed herself something she hadn't before, glimmer of hope. Perhaps love could grow where it was least expected. Perhaps two people thrust together by circumstance could create a life that neither had imagined. Returning home, however, the tension did not dissipate. The threats from Rahul's past loomed over them, like shadows that refused to retreat even in daylight. Their interactions became more urgent, more deliberate. Every conversation, every meal, every glance carried the weight of newfound vulnerability. And yet, despite the fear, moments of tenderness emerged. Aisha began leaving small notes for him, carefully worded messages tucked into folders, reminders that she was thinking of him. He responded in kind, subtle gestures that spoke louder than any words. A warm cup of tea left by her bedside, a jacket draped over her chair when the evening chill set in, a hand brushing against hers while passing through the kitchen. One evening, as they prepared dinner together, a rare quiet settling around the house, Aisha paused, knife in hand. The rhythm of chopping and stirring was hypnotic, almost meditative. She found herself studying him, noticing details she had overlooked before, the way his brow furrowed when he concentrated, the small scar above his wrist, the faint, almost imperceptible tension in his jaw that eased only when he believed no one was watching. "You're different than I thought," she said softly. He looked up, startled. "Different? Yes, I thought you'd be distant, cold, but you're not entirely," he smiled, a brief fleeting thing that didn't quite reach his eyes but was honest nonetheless. "I'm trying," he admitted. "Trying not to let the past define the present." It was in that quiet admission, in the shared vulnerability of that kitchen, that Aisha realized something fundamental. Love wasn't always explosive or immediate. Sometimes it was slow, deliberate, carved out in the smallest gestures, in shared moments of fear and courage, in the silent acknowledgement of each other's flaws and fears. Days turned into weeks, and the storm that had brought them together, though now past, left behind subtle traces of tension that had shifted into trust, a fear that had evolved into reliance. But life, as it often does, has a way of testing the delicate patterns we create. One afternoon, a package arrived for Aisha, wrapped in plain brown paper, no return address. She opened it cautiously and found a small journal, worn and old, filled with handwritten entries. The handwriting was unfamiliar, looping and precise, and the content immediately unsettled her. Stories of Rahul's life before the contract, confessions of regrets, names, places, events she had never known. The pages hinted at dangers, allies and enemies, some long thought gone, some still very much alive. Aisha's hands shook as she read. This wasn't just a glimpse into his past. It was a revelation that their lives, already complicated, were entangled in forces far larger than either of them had imagined. And yet, even as fear gripped her, there was an undeniable fascination. She wanted to know, to understand, to step fully into the world that had shaped the man she was slowly coming to care for. Rahul returned home that evening to find her sitting on the floor, the journal open, eyes wide and restless. He knelt beside her, a mix of concern and resignation on his face. "You've seen it," he said softly. "Yes," she whispered. I didn't know." "You can't unsee it," he said, "but you can choose what we do next." Together, that word together carried weight beyond the promise of marriage. It was a pledge, an acknowledgement that no matter the shadows, no matter the threats, they would navigate this world side by side. And so they began to prepare, not for an ordinary life, not for a simple existence, but for the collision of past and present, for the reckoning that was inevitable. They trained, they strategized, and more importantly, they talked not just in the measured, cautious tones of a contract, but in the language of real, fragile emotion. Then, one night, a breakthrough occurred. Aisha, unable to sleep, wandered into the garden, the cool night air brushing against her skin. Rahul followed silently, and together they sat beneath the stars, the world vast and indifferent above them. "I was wrong," she said finally. "I thought I could separate duty from feeling, but I can't. I can't care about you." He reached for her hand, their fingers entwining naturally. "I care about you too," he admitted, voice low, steady. "More than I ever imagined I could, more than this contract ever intended." They sat there, silence enveloping them, the soft rustle of leaves a lullaby to their hearts, and in that quiet, Aisha understood something profound. Love could not be scheduled, could not be negotiated. It was messy, unpredictable, and terrifying, but also the only thing that made the storm they faced feel survivable. Just as relief settled over them, a sudden piercing sound shattered the neat, a single gunshot, echoing across the estate. They jumped to their feet, hearts racing, adrenaline surging. The past, it seemed, had finally caught up with them, and in that moment, they knew with terrifying clarity that nothing, not love, not trust, not courage would protect them unless they faced what was coming together. Aisha gripped Rahul's arm, fear and determination interwoven in her touch. "We face it," she said. He nodded, eyes dark but resolute, together, and as the camera pans out, leaving them silhouetted against the moonlit estate, the distant shadows moving with purpose in the darkness, one truth crystallizes. Their story is no longer just about a contract marriage. It is about survival, about trust, about love forged in fire. And the next chapter promises to test them in ways they could never have anticipated. The gunshot echoed in their ears long after the night had swallowed the sound, reverberating through the walls, through the hallways, and through their very bones. Aisha's heart thudded violently, each beat punctuated by the realization that the fragile bubble of safety they had created was gone. Rain had ceased, but the world outside felt fractured as if the storm had only moved underground, creeping in shadows that had always existed but now stretched toward them with deliberate intent. Rahul's grip on her arm was steady, anchoring her even as adrenaline and fear surged through her. Inside, he commanded, his voice low but urgent, and she obeyed without hesitation. They moved through the house silently, feet careful on polished floors, ears straining for the faintest hint of movement. The gunshot had been no accident. Someone was here, watching, testing, waiting for them to falter. In the study, lights were dim, shadows pooling in corners, and the air smelled faintly of rain and electricity. Rahul retrieved the journal she had discovered days before, flipping through pages as if seeking a secret the words themselves might yield. Aisha watched him, noticing for the first time the tension in his shoulders, the slight quiver in his jaw, a vulnerability that made her chest tighten. He had been composed for so long, but now the cracks were showing, and in them she saw the man beyond the contract, beyond the obligations, and beyond the fear. She couldn't remain still. "Rahul," she whispered, voice barely audible over her own ragged breathing. "What if this, whoever it is, what if they're not bluffing?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the room, lingering on the framed photographs, on the objects that mapped a life she had only glimpsed through fragments of confession and journal entries. Finally he spoke, voice quiet, almost mournful. "They're not bluffing, and we've underestimated them." The words landed like stones. Aisha's mind raced. For weeks she had clung to the idea that the danger was external, something separate from their lives, something they could anticipate and counter. But now it was clear that the threat was not just a shadow at the periphery. It was woven into the very fabric of Rahul's past, entangled with every choice, every secret, every unspoken regret. And yet, despite the fear, something stirred in her, a fierce, almost reckless determination. She realized that she had grown dependent on him in ways she hadn't acknowledged. Not just for protection, though that was part of it, but for understanding, for connection, for the fragile thread of trust they had spun together. The thought made her chest ache. She had begun to care for him not as a contractual obligation, but as someone whose presence had become essential to her survival, to her sense of being. The night deepened. Outside the estate was cloaked in black, and the faint hum of the city was distant, almost unreal. Their first step was to secure the perimeter, to understand whether the gunshot had been a random warning or the opening move of something far more calculated. Rahul led the way, flashlight cutting through the darkness, Aisha following closely, their movements synchronized, instinctual. In the garage, they found signs of intrusion, scuff marks on the concrete, tire tracks not matching their own vehicles, mud that hadn't been there in the daylight. Fear prickled along her spine, but it was mingled with an adrenaline-fueled clarity that sharpened her senses. Every creak, every whisper of movement made her hyper-aware, and yet for the first time she felt a strange exhilaration. She was no longer a passive observer in their precarious world. She was an active participant, entwined in the strategy and survival that defined Rahul's life. Rahul's phone buzzed, cutting through the tense silence. He glanced at it, brows knitting. "It's a message," he said, voice tight. The text was simple, almost banal, but its implications were anything but. "You can't protect her from the truth. She needs to know." Aisha's stomach sank. The truth. She had assumed the past was dangerous, yes, but that it could remain distant, controlled, a series of threats they could neutralize. But the message implied something more insidious: knowledge, revelation, a reckoning that could change everything between them. "I don't understand," she murmured, hands trembling slightly. Rahul's gaze softened, but it carried a weight that made her pause. "You've only seen fragments of my life," he admitted. "Fragments meant to protect you, but there's more, far more. Things I've kept buried because I wanted to shield you from the chaos. But maybe now it's too late for that." Her breath caught. "What are you saying?" He hesitated, swallowing hard. "I think they're going to force your hand, make you see what I couldn't hide. And when that happens, everything changes, including us." They spent the next hours in tense preparation, reviewing security cameras, tracing every possible route of intrusion, reinforcing doors and windows. The house, which had once been a sanctuary, now felt like a fortress, walls and locks standing between them and a world that had become unpredictable, even hostile. Yet, amid the chaos, there were moments of unexpected intimacy. Aisha found Rahul in the kitchen, quietly packing supplies, and for the briefest moment, they exchanged a glance that held more than just strategy. It was acknowledgement, gratitude, connection. "You're incredible," she said softly, almost ashamed of the tremor in her voice. He smiled faintly, a ghost of amusement touching his features. "You don't realize how much I've needed you," he admitted. The admission was raw, unguarded. Aisha felt a lump in her throat. She wanted to respond, to confess the truth that had been building within her for weeks, but the weight of the night, the storm of events, made words fragile, inadequate. Later, when the house fell silent, they sat together in the living room, the only light coming from the muted glow of the fireplace. Rain had stopped entirely, leaving a chill that seeped into their bones. They spoke quietly, reflecting on the past days, on the tension, the fear, and the small, unacknowledged moments that had drawn them closer. And then came the twist that shifted everything, a revelation buried within the journal Aisha had found. A passage she had skimmed over before now demanded attention. It spoke of a hidden alliance, of people close to Rahul who were not enemies but had been masquerading in the shadows, manipulating events to orchestrate his downfall while presenting themselves as allies. The implications were staggering. The danger had never been entirely external. It had been seeded from within, from people he trusted, from people whose motives were obscured beneath layers of loyalty and deception. Aisha's mind raced. "So it's not just the strangers from the warehouse," she said slowly. "Someone close to you, someone we trusted, has been playing us." Rahul nodded, jaw tight. "Yes, and I think tonight's attack, the gunshot, it was a warning, a test. They're watching, observing, waiting for the right moment to strike." Fear surged, but alongside it, a strange clarity emerged. The challenge was no longer just survival. It was discernment, unmasking deceit, navigating alliances and betrayals. The world they had entered was infinitely more complex than they had imagined, and the stakes were no longer simply life and death. They were trust, love, and the fragile construction of the bond they had begun to build. As the night deepened, they began to piece together clues, tracing past events, reviewing interactions, and analyzing patterns that previously seemed trivial. The process was exhausting, both mentally and emotionally, yet it drew them closer in the quiet moments, when tension allowed for reflection. Aisha found herself seeing Rahul not just as a man ensnared by circumstance, but as someone profoundly human, flawed, haunted, and resilient in ways that made her care for him more deeply than she had thought possible. But the night was not done testing them. A faint noise, almost imperceptible, came from the back of the house, a soft click that set both their nerves alight. They froze, senses straining, hearts synchronized in fear and anticipation. The realization hit them simultaneously. The game had changed. The enemy was inside the perimeter, closer than they had dared imagine. Rahul moved first, signaling Aisha to follow silently. Together they crept through the house, lights extinguished, shadows wrapping around them like dark silk. Every step was measured, every breath deliberate. And then, in the dim glow of the kitchen, they saw a figure crouched near the back door, a familiar face partially obscured by the night. Recognition struck Aisha like a physical blow. It was someone Rahul had considered a friend, someone whose loyalty she had never questioned, someone now revealed as part of the dangerous network manipulating their lives. Her stomach churned, betrayal and fear intermingling with a fierce protective instinct she felt for Rahul. The figure froze when they realized they had been seen. Time seemed to stretch, every second laden with tension. Rahul stepped forward, calm but commanding. "Why?" he demanded. "After everything, why betray us?" The answer was a whisper, barely audible over the pounding of Aisha's heart. "Because some truths are more dangerous than love." Aisha's breath caught. The words hinted at secrets she had never imagined. Layers of deceit and danger that threatened not only their lives but the very foundation of the fragile bond forming between them. And in that instant, the world she thought she understood, the past, the contract, the fledgling trust, fractured once more. They stood there, three figures in the dim light, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down like the oppressive heat of a summer storm. The night stretched endlessly around them, filled with possibility and peril, love and betrayal, fear and revelation. Aisha realized then that survival would demand more than courage. It would demand insight, resilience, and a willingness to confront the truths that terrified them most. And as she looked at Rahul, standing firm despite the betrayal, she understood something essential. Love, even when real, could not exist in isolation from the chaos that surrounded it. It had to contend with every shadow, every deception, every hidden agenda. The question that now dominated her thoughts, the one that would define the next chapter of their lives, was as stark as it was unavoidable. How far are you willing to go to protect love when the enemy wears the mask of trust? The answer, she knew, would not come easily. But one thing was certain: their journey had only just begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. The night that followed the betrayal felt heavier than any storm they had faced. Silence had returned to the house, but it was the kind of silence that presses against your chest, heavy with anticipation and unspoken fear. The lights in the living room flickered intermittently, casting long, twitching shadows that crawled along the walls, and every creak of the floorboards sounded like the approach of an unseen threat. Aisha could feel the weight of the night pressing down on her, making her chest tight, making her thoughts whirl uncontrollably. Rahul moved with deliberate care, checking locks, inspecting windows, double-checking the perimeter. Every motion was precise, controlled. But Aisha could see the tension that gripped him. The way his jaw tightened every time a shadow moved across the room. The subtle tremor in his hands when he thought she wasn't watching. For the first time, the man she had come to care for, whose composure she had admired so fiercely, was undeniably human, vulnerable, aware of the stakes in a way that made her own fears feel immediate and tangible. They didn't speak much. Words seemed almost inadequate, an intrusion on the fragile thread of awareness that bound them together. Instead, they moved in silence, communicating through glances and gestures, their bond growing in these quiet, urgent moments. Aisha noticed the subtle patterns, how he always made sure she was near the exits, how he positioned himself between her and potential danger, how he paused before speaking, weighing the weight of every word. There was care in these movements, unspoken and deliberate, and the thought that he might actually feel the same depth of emotion she had kept her heart racing. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost all sense in the darkness. They found themselves in the study again, the journal laid open between them, revealing secrets and warnings that no longer felt distant or abstract. Each entry seemed to pulse with a quiet menace, a rhythm of danger that beat in time with their own racing hearts. Names, dates, events, they were threads in a web far larger than either of them could fully comprehend, and yet they had to begin untangling it if they wanted to survive. "I don't know who to trust," Aisha whispered finally, breaking the suffocating quiet. Her voice sounded fragile even to her own ears. Rahul didn't answer immediately. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck, eyes dark pools of thought. "Trust is complicated," he admitted, "especially when the people who claim to protect you are the ones setting the traps. We'll have to rely on each other completely. Nothing else matters right now." Aisha swallowed hard, nodding. There was a strange, almost electrifying weight in that statement, a sense of being tethered together by circumstance and necessity, by something deeper than strategy, by the fragile growing bond that had begun in silence, in fear, and now pulsed with a new undeniable intensity. The night deepened further, and with it came movement outside. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, calculated. They froze, listening. The house was no longer theirs alone. It had become a stage, and the shadows around them were actors in a dangerous play. Aisha's pulse quickened, every nerve alert. She realized that fear, though overwhelming, had sharpened her instincts in a way she hadn't anticipated. Her senses were acute, every sound amplified, every shadow a potential threat. Rahul's hand found hers, gripping tightly, grounding them both. "Stay close," he whispered, and she did, heart hammering against her ribs as they moved through the dimly lit corridors, their steps synchronized in an unspoken rhythm. They reached the kitchen, and the intruder or intruders had left subtle signs of passage. A knife slightly shifted, a chair nudged, a faint smudge on the marble countertop. Each detail was deliberate, a message that they were being watched, tested, and perhaps manipulated. The danger was no longer abstract. It was immediate, tangible, pressing in on every side. Aisha's mind raced with possibilities. Who were they? What did they want? And most terrifyingly, how much did they know about her, about Rahul, about the fragile trust and the fledgling love that had begun to form between them? The questions multiplied unanswered, each one heavier than the last, pressing down with relentless intensity. Hours bled into dawn. Fatigue weighed on their bodies, but there was no rest, no reprieve. They sat together in the dim glow of the study lamp, poring over every entry in the journal, cross-referencing notes, reconstructing timelines. Every revelation brought new complications, subtle nuances that deepened the danger and revealed layers of intrigue neither had anticipated. And then a discovery struck like lightning. An entry describing an event from Rahul's past that he had never shared a meeting. A betrayal, a calculated act that had ripple effects even now. Aisha's fingers trembled as she traced the lines of the page, reading aloud the words that reshaped her understanding of the man she was beginning to love. Rahul leaned over her shoulder, eyes scanning the same lines, but his expression was unreadable, tense. This changes everything," she said, voice barely audible. "It's not just about survival, it's about consequences, about choices we can't undo." He nodded slowly, jaw tight. "Yes," he said, "and we have to anticipate the fallout. They won't stop until every piece of the past is exposed, including me." Aisha felt a chill run down her spine. The stakes had escalated far beyond what she had imagined. The threat wasn't just physical, it was personal, emotional, a force capable of unraveling everything they had built. Trust, love, hope. As the day broke, the light filtering through the curtains revealed their exhaustion, their shared determination, and the subtle intimacy that had grown from weeks of fear, collaboration, and slowly emerging affection. They were no longer just a husband and wife bound by contract. They were partners in a battle that demanded complete reliance, a bond tested by betrayal, fear, and the unpredictable forces of the past. And yet, even amid preparation, even amid the tension, moments of humanity persisted. Aisha found Rahul staring out the window, fingers tracing the raindrops, clinging to the glass. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, voice breaking the tension, "if we can survive this and still be us?" He turned to her, eyes soft but hard with resolve. I don't know, he admitted, but I know I can't do it without you. The words, simple and unadorned, carried a weight that made her chest ache with a strange combination of fear and relief. They spent the next hours reinforcing the house, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Their movements were methodical, precise, yet tinged with urgency, a subtle rhythm of survival that kept them alert and focused. Every sound outside, every whisper in the wind, every flicker of shadow heightened the tension, a reminder that the world they inhabited was no longer predictable or safe. As night fell again, Aisha and Rahul sat together in the dimly lit living room, reviewing plans and contingencies. The shadows around them seemed alive, flickering with the memory of past betrayals, present dangers, and the unknown that awaited them. Every detail mattered. Every decision carried weight. The bond between them had shifted, grown, hardened against the pressure of external threats, and yet remained fragile in the face of uncertainty. And then, just as they were preparing to settle into a fragile vigil, a sound pierced the night, soft at first, almost imperceptible, then unmistakable, the click of a lock. Someone had entered the perimeter. The house was no longer a sanctuary, it was a trap, and they were both fully aware that the confrontation they had anticipated was imminent. Aisha's pulse surged, fear and adrenaline intermingling with a strange, fierce clarity. She realized that everything they had prepared, every strategy, every contingency, was about to be tested. And for the first time, the future felt not just uncertain, but precariously balanced on a single, trembling thread. Rahul's hand found hers again, fingers intertwining, grounding them both. No matter what happens, he said, voice steady, despite the tension, we face it together. Always. The words hung in the air like a promise and a warning. Outside, shadows shifted. The wind whispered through the trees, and the faintest trace of movement signaled that the night was far from over. They were ready, or as ready as anyone could be. Yet in the pit of her stomach, Aisha knew this was only the calm before a storm far greater than anything they had faced. The truth, the danger, and the choices ahead loomed larger than ever, and the first strike was only a heartbeat away. She drew a steadying breath, matching Rahul's, feeling the bond between them solidifying the crucible of fear and determination. Whatever came next, they would confront it together. But the question that now consumed her mind was unavoidable. How much can love survive when the world demands survival first, and truth second? And as the faint creak of the floorboards signaled the approach of what Horhu was coming, Aisha realized that nothing could have prepared them for the revelation awaiting them in the shadows. The night held its breath, and so did they, teetering on the edge of a storm that promised to change everything. The intruder was there, framed by the dim light of the hallway, mask half fallen, revealing the face that had haunted Rahul's past and now tested every ounce of their courage. Aisha's breath caught, chest tightening, heart hammering against ribs that felt too small for the adrenaline surging through her veins. She gripped Rahul's hand so tightly it ached, seeking both grounding and assurance, and found it. He squeezed back, a silent promise. Whatever happened, they would face it together. Why Rahul's voice was low, deliberate, the kind of tone that carries both rage and sorrow. The words seemed to vibrate in the space around them, stirring the shadows, making them tremble. After everything, why betray me? Why risk everything? The figure hesitated, then spoke, voice almost human now, breaking the rhythm of tension like a whisper against a drumbeat. Because you never saw it coming. You never knew who was truly loyal. You thought control could save you, but control is an illusion. Aisha's eyes darted between Rahul and the intruder, mind racing. She recognized the subtle cues, now the small gestures, the missed signals in the journal, the moments that had seemed inconsequential but were deliberately calculated. Every piece fell into place, forming a pattern that was both terrifying and illuminating. The person before them had been orchestrating more than threats. They had been shaping the story itself. Rahul stepped forward, shielding her with his body. You underestimated us, he said. There was no hesitation, no fear in his tone, only an iron resolve that seemed to fill the room. We aren't just pawns in your game. A shadow of a smile flickered across the intruder's face. Pawns, no. You're pieces, yes, but every piece can move in unexpected ways. That's the beauty of chaos. The room seemed to shrink. Every heartbeat echoed loudly. The faint hum of the city beyond the walls faded until it was nothing but the tension between the three of them. Aisha's mind was a storm of questions and fear, but somewhere in the chaos, a clarity emerged. This was no longer only about survival. It was about revelation, about truth, about understanding the forces that had shaped the life they were trying to build together. Suddenly, the intruder moved, swift and deliberate, and Rahul's body tensed like a spring. In one fluid motion, he intercepted, blocking a knife thrust meant for him. Aisha gasped, hands clenching his arms. Time slowed. The movements, the fear, the closeness, they all crystallized into a singular, raw intensity. You won't take her, Rahul said, voice low but sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. Not now, not ever. For a moment, there was silence, then a sound, a click of the weapon being set down, the slow step of surrender, the subtle acknowledgement that the fight was not just physical. The intruder's eyes softened, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. And then, unexpectedly, words fell that no one had anticipated. "You were right, about everything. About love, about trust, about what really matters." Aisha's breath caught. She had thought the danger was external, that fear would always overshadow connection. But now, in the space of that recognition, she saw it. The human cost of deception, the fragility of trust, and the staggering strength required to claim love in a world determined to withhold it. Rahul's grip on her hand loosened slightly, and he moved toward the intruder, eyes still wary but understanding the shift. "Then tell us," he said. "Tell us everything. Why now? Why reveal it here?" The intruder's gaze fell to the floor, and the room seemed to grow colder, quieter. Words emerged slowly, measured, heavy with regret. Names were spoken, alliances revealed. The motivations that had driven months of fear and misdirection crystallized into clarity. Aisha listened, every line a revelation, every detail a key unlocking the labyrinth of the past. She realized that the threats, the shadows, and the betrayals had all been tests not just of survival, but of character, resilience, and the very bonds she and Rahul had begun to forge. As the confession ended, a hush settled over the room. The danger, once immediate, now lingered in the quiet, transformed. It was no longer a physical threat but an emotional reckoning. A moment where truth and love collided in a way that demanded acknowledgement. Aisha felt herself trembling not from fear, but from the weight of understanding. The chaos of the past had been laid bare, and with it the fragile architecture of their bond. Rahul turned to her then, eyes intense, voice low. "Do you understand now? This us, everything we've survived, it's not by chance. It's because we made it real, together." She nodded, words caught in her throat. The intimacy between them, forged through fear and tension, had reached a point of inevitability. The contract, the obligations, the external threats, they were no longer what defined them. What defined them was the choice, the deliberate, messy, courageous choice to trust and to care, even when the world demanded calculation and control. The intruder stepped back, finally removing the mask entirely, revealing the full depth of their history and connections. The revelation hit like a storm, unexpected, intricate, transformative. Every assumption Aisha had made was challenged. Every belief Rahul had held was tested. The person before them was both enemy and informant, betrayer and messenger, a paradox that reshaped the narrative entirely. A long silence followed, the kind that holds weight, that stretches perception, that allows the magnitude of what has just occurred to sink into every bone and thought. Outside, the first light of dawn crept along the horizon, pale and hesitant, reflecting off the polished floors and the anxious faces in the room. For the first time in weeks, there was a moment of stillness, a pause in the storm that had consumed their lives. Aisha exhaled slowly, feeling the tension bleed away, replaced by clarity, relief, and something almost terrifying in its intensity. Hope. She realized the enormity of what had been revealed, the fragility of trust rebuilt, and the astonishing depth of feeling that had grown between her and Rahul. Love, she understood, was not passive. It was a force as volatile as fear, as consuming as danger, and as transformative as truth. Rahul reached out, pulling her close, and in that embrace, the weight of the past, the storm of the present, and the promise of the future converged. Their breathing synchronized, hearts beating in tandem, and the room seemed to exhale with them, releasing the tension that had accumulated, if only for a fleeting moment. The intruder, now silent, watched, eyes reflecting both sorrow and understanding. Their role had shifted, their threat neutralized by the very bond they had tried to test, and as they stepped back, leaving the room to the couple, Aisha felt a strange serenity, a sense that the chaos was not over, but that the peak had been reached, and clarity was possible. For the first time in weeks, the world felt expansive rather than oppressive. The danger was real, yes, but so was the choice to act, to love, to survive, to confront whatever came next together. Every scar, every betrayal, every whispered fear had led to this apex. The truth revealed, the bond confirmed, the stakes unmistakable. They stayed in the living room for hours, watching the pale light stretch across the walls. Words were unnecessary. Touches, glances, the subtle press of a hand against a hand spoke volumes. Reflection took the place of chaos. Breathing replaced panic, and for the first time they allowed themselves to acknowledge what had been unspoken for so long. They were no longer merely partners in convenience. They were allies, lovers, survivors. As dawn deepened into morning, a gentle tension remained, a promise that the storm had shifted, but that vigilance would still be required. They had survived the confrontation, faced the revelation, and yet the world outside was unchanged, indifferent, waiting. But inside, in this fragile space, they had found something far more valuable: understanding, trust, and the first true spark of love that was their own. Unbound by contract or fear, Aisha rested her head against Rahul's shoulder, eyes closed, feeling the rhythm of his heartbeat against her ear. "We've made it," she whispered. He pressed a kiss to her temple, slow, deliberate, grounding. "For now," he said softly. "But we survive together, always. That's what matters." Outside, the city stirred, indifferent to their triumphs and fears. Inside, the air was still heavy with aftermath, charged with emotion. The storm had passed, but its lessons lingered, echoing in every glance, every touch, every unspoken word between them. And as the sunlight slowly filled the room, the tension gradually released, replaced by a quiet anticipation. The climax had arrived, truth had been unveiled, but the journey was far from over. The bond formed in shadows, tested by betrayal, and strengthened by survival, now faced a future still uncertain. Yet, in that moment, Aisha and Rahul allowed themselves a fleeting certainty. They had survived the peak of the storm, and in that survival they had discovered something profound. Love, when forged in the crucible of fear and truth, was both fragile and indestructible, delicate yet enduring, terrifying yet inexorably real. The room softened as light spilled across faces and hands entwined, the energy of confrontation replaced by reflection, by intimacy, by understanding. And as they sat together, the quiet hum of the world outside a gentle reminder that life continued. The first faint stirrings of hope whispered in their hearts that whatever came next, they would meet it as one. The horizon outside promised clarity, yet carried the weight of unresolved threads, new challenges, new revelations, waiting to unfold. But for now, in this suspended moment, they were together, unbroken, and the world felt momentarily right. The storm had peaked. Now came the pause, the delicate, fleeting breath before the next chapter of their lives demanded action, courage, and the full measure of their hearts. Morning arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, slipping across the estate like a soft exhale. The storm that had dominated nights of fear, secrets, and revelations had passed, leaving behind traces of its power in the wind-chilled air and puddles that glimmered like shards of glass in the pale light. Aisha stood by the window, tracing a finger along the condensation, watching droplets chase each other down the glass. The city beyond stirred slowly, unconcerned, indifferent, a world that had carried on even as their own universe had been appended by shadows, betrayal, and fear. Rahul came up behind her, hand brushing her shoulder lightly, a gesture that spoke of shared nights spent in tension, in vigilance, in understanding that could never be forced but had grown unbidden between them. He didn't speak at first. Neither of them needed words. The silence was a continuation of the trust they had painstakingly rebuilt, an acknowledgement that survival had forged a bond deeper than any contract or obligation ever could. "You're awake early," he murmured finally, voice gentle, carrying the weight of nights spent sleepless, planning, fearing. "I couldn't sleep," Aisha admitted, leaning slightly into him. "Too many thoughts, too much still." Processing, her eyes didn't leave the window. The sunlight was soft now, warm but not blinding, and the world seemed to exhale with them. "I keep thinking about how much of our lives are controlled by things we can't see or understand, decisions we didn't make, threats we didn't anticipate." And yet, she turned toward him, letting the words linger. "Yet we found each other in all of that." He nodded, eyes following hers, tracing the same lines in the air, seeing the reflection of himself and the woman who had become so much more than a partner bound by circumstance. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the world throws chaos at us, expects us to bend or break. But maybe the point isn't control. Maybe the point is choosing who you stand with, who you trust, and who you let in fully, without hesitation. Even if it scares you." Aisha felt her chest tighten, a mixture of awe and understanding swelling in her. That fear, that chaos, had defined their lives for weeks, but it had also illuminated something that neither of them could have anticipated. The depth of human connection, the courage it takes to open oneself to another, and the fragile resilience that emerges when two people decide to face everything together. They moved through the house slowly, deliberately, the world quiet, almost reverent. The rooms bore subtle marks of their ordeal, the knocked chair in the kitchen, the scuffed floorboards of the hallway, but these were no longer threats. They were remnants, evidence of endurance, of choices made under pressure, of moments where fear had been transformed into action, courage, and ultimately, trust. In the garden, sunlight streamed through the branches of the old trees, casting mottled shadows across the lawn. Aisha knelt to examine the small puddles of rainwater, watching ripples fan outward, each circle intersecting with the next. She thought of how their lives had intersected in unexpected ways, how love had emerged in the spaces between obligation and fear, how trust had been both tested and reclaimed. Rahul joined her, crouching beside her, their hands brushing in the soft light. "Do you ever think," he asked, voice barely above the whisper of the breeze, "about how strange it is, that love can find its way even in the most controlled, calculated spaces, that it can grow where it isn't supposed to?" Aisha looked at him, eyes steady, heart full. "I think maybe that's the point," she said. "It doesn't follow the rules we expect. It doesn't wait for the perfect conditions. It just happens. And maybe the only way to honor it is to be present, to choose it, even when the world is loud and chaotic and unfair." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that is quiet but profound. A smile born from relief, understanding, and something deeper. "Then we've chosen wisely," he said, voice low, almost reverent, "not because it was easy, not because it was planned, but because it felt like the only truth we could hold on to. They walked together along the edge of the garden, sunlight warming their faces, the air fragrant with wet earth and new growth. Aisha noticed small details she had missed before: the delicate curve of a flower petal, the way sunlight danced across the leaves, the way the wind carried a faint playful rustle through the branches. The world was ordinary again, mundane even, and yet it felt sacred. Ordinary life had resumed, but they had emerged transformed. They paused at a bench beneath an old oak tree. Rahul sat first, hands folded loosely in his lap, eyes thoughtful. Aisha joined him, settling close, their shoulders touching. There was no urgency here, no external threat pressing on them, just the lingering weight of what they had endured, and the quiet, almost holy, acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged through fear, through confrontation, through the relentless tests of the past weeks. "I keep thinking about the contract," Aisha said quietly. "About how it started, about how unnatural it all felt at first." She traced a finger along the bench's worn wood, looking at the faint grooves and scratches left over time. "And yet, it led us here to this, to understanding." To each other, Rahul reached for her hand, covering it with his own. "Maybe the contract wasn't the point," he said softly. "Maybe it was the circumstances, the constraints, the challenges that forced us to see who we really were, what we were capable of, and what we valued most." Aisha leaned her head against his shoulder, letting the warmth of his presence seep into her. "And what we value most," she said, voice quiet, reflective, "isn't control. It isn't safety, it isn't even certainty. It's the choice, the courage to trust, to stay, to love even when the world demands otherwise." He pressed a kiss to her temple, slow, deliberate. "Then we've learned the most important lesson of all," he said. "That love isn't about contracts or agreements. It's about presence, choice, and the willingness to be vulnerable, fully, completely, without fear of what comes next." For a long moment, they sat together, the world holding its breath around them. A faint breeze stirred the branches, carrying the distant murmur of the city, the soft hum of life continuing elsewhere. And in that quiet, suspended moment, Aisha felt the enormity of their journey, the fear, the betrayal, the revelations, and the love that had emerged not despite the trials but because of them. She raised her head slightly, looking into Rahul's eyes, seeing in them the reflection of everything they had endured and everything they had built together. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, almost to herself, "how much of life's chaos is necessary to show us what matters? How many storms must we survive to understand the value of what we hold?" He smiled, thoughtful, contemplative. "Perhaps that's the eternal question," he replied, "and maybe the answer is different for everyone. But what we've learned, we'll carry it always." They rose from the bench, moving slowly back toward the house, hands intertwined, shadows stretching behind them like silent witnesses. The estate, bathed in morning light, was peaceful now. The remnants of past threats remained as subtle marks, but they no longer held power over the present. The world was ordinary, and yet charged with the significance of what had transpired. Every step forward was deliberate, conscious, a celebration of survival, resilience, and love. Inside the house seemed lighter, air warm and dry, windows reflecting sunlight rather than shadows. Aisha walked through the rooms, touching familiar surfaces, noticing the textures, the colors, the details she had taken for granted. Each object seemed to carry memory not just of fear and conflict, but of endurance, courage, and connection. The house was no longer merely shelter. It was a testament to what they had endured together. Rahul joined her in the hallway, and they paused, hands clasped, letting the moment stretch between them. The past had tested them, the present had challenged them, and now in this fragile dawn, the future waited open, uncertain, but shared. Aisha closed her eyes for a moment, drawing in the scent of sunlight and wood, feeling the rhythm of life around them. "We survived," she whispered, not as a statement of relief, but as a quiet acknowledgement of choice, love, and resilience. "Yes," Rahul said softly, "and we will continue to, together no matter what comes." The two of them stood in the quiet of the house, light spilling through windows, warmth settling over their shoulders, the weight of fear and revelation replaced by something enduring, something real. They had begun as strangers bound by obligation, moved through chaos and betrayal, and now arrived at understanding, trust, and love enforced, undeniable, and fully claimed. Outside, the world moved on indifferent, ordinary, beautiful in its continuity. Inside, Aisha and Rahul shared a glance, a breath, a touch. The lessons of their journey lingered, that trust could be rebuilt, that courage could be found in the smallest moments, and that love, even born from the most unlikely circumstances, could endure if nurtured with care and choice. As they stepped into the sunlight, side by side, shadows lengthening behind them, Aisha wondered quietly, almost to herself, how many storms must one face to understand the true measure of love? And how often do we wait for chaos to teach us what courage and trust really mean? Rahul squeezed her hand, answering not with words, but with presence, a quiet certainty that whatever storms remained, they would meet them together. And as the camera would pull back, rising over the estate, over the trees glistening with dew, over the city stretching toward the horizon. The story felt complete yet infinite. The chaos had passed, but the bond endured. The storm had tested them, revealed them, and ultimately revealed the extraordinary within the ordinary. Aisha and Rahul moved forward, not unscathed, but unbroken. The light bathed them in the promise of what had been learned, the hope of what was yet to come, and the undeniable truth that some love, once found, was worth every storm endured, every secret uncovered, and every choice made with courage. And in that quiet, suspended